Sometimes a person's resistance is like a closed door without a handle. You push, force, insist, and the more you try to enter, the more rigid it becomes. But what if that door was never meant to be pushed? What if she only opened up when she realized there was no threat from the other side? There is a type of silence that disarms, a form of presence that does not demand, does not dispute, does not pressure. In nature, nothing begs to be accepted. The river does not convince the mountain to leave it pass. He simply remains there, patient, until the rock itself recognizes the path. In human life, we forget this. We believe that collaboration comes from the perfect explanation, the right argument, the well-placed authority. But, deep down, when someone doesn't want to help, it's not a lack of ability. It's defense. It's protection. It is the invisible instinct to preserve one's inner space. And the more we try to cross that threshold with sharp words, the more the other closes himself off, even without realizing why. What few realize is that there is a phrase, simple, almost invisible, that does not push, does not invade, does not ask for obedience. She doesn't ask for help directly. It offers space. And paradoxically, this is precisely what sparks collaboration, even those who swore they didn't want to get involved. This phrase doesn't work because it's clever. It works because it is born from a specific internal state, a state where you don't need to win, convince, or prove anything, a state in which your presence says without sound, "You are safe here. Nothing will be taken from you." In spirituality that observes nature, we learn that the invisible precedes the gesture. Before the word, there is the intention. Before intention, there is alignment. And when this alignment happens, human relationships begin to reorganize alone, like leaves that move when they feel the change in the wind. In this video, we are not going to talk about social techniques or manipulation. Let's talk about posture, of softness, on how to become someone who does not provoke resistance. And for this very reason, he finds help where before there was only refusal. If something in you feels like you've tried to force the world too much, if there is a silent fatigue in convincing people who don't want to listen, stay here. Perhaps this is an invitation to walk in a different way. And if this journey resonates with you, it is a sign that something invisible has already started to move. There is a conflict that is rarely said out loud. It does not happen in words, but in the space between them. It does not arise from explicit refusal, but from the silent tension that arises when two wills meet, and neither wants to give in. When we ask for help, something invisible lights up in the other person. Even before understanding the request, the body reacts. Shoulders stiffen. Breathing changes. The mind begins to calculate losses, risks, obligations. Help, which could be a natural gesture, starts to be perceived as an invasion. This happens because, deep down, every request carries energy, and this energy can sound like an invitation or a threat. In nature, the wind does not argue with the mountain. When it encounters resistance, it does not increase volume. He changes direction, goes around, waits. And yet, over time, it creates valleys where there was only stone before. Human beings, however, learned the opposite way. When it encounters resistance, it pushes. When he notices hesitation, he insists. When he feels distance, he tries to dominate the space with explanations, justifications, pressure, emotional. And it is at this point that the invisible conflict is established. The other person, even without meaning to, goes into defense mode. Not because you are wrong, but because something in her feels like she will lose autonomy. Help is no longer a choice. It starts to feel like an obligation. And where there is obligation, the spirit withdraws. Many believe that collaboration comes from clarity, but in fact it arises from security. People help when they feel that they will not be used, charged, or swallowed by the request. They help when they realize they are still free to say no. This is the paradox. The more you need someone to help, less space is usually left for this help to be offered spontaneously. It's like dammed water. When pressed against a wall, it accumulates destructive force. But when it finds a small opening, it flows lightly, effortlessly. In everyday life, we see this all the time. At work, when a request comes loaded with urgency and control, people collaborate only as little as necessary. or resist in silence. In the family, when help is accompanied by emotional expectation, the other closes himself off, even though he wants to do good. In relationships, when support is required, it loses the flavor of affection. The conflict is never about the request itself. It's about the space it occupies. When someone feels that their inner territory will be invaded, even the simplest request turns into a burden. And, instinctively, human beings move away from what threatens their integrity. Therefore, insisting rarely works. Argue from, but it usually gets worse. Over-explaining creates more resistance than clarity. True collaboration arises when the other realizes something essential. I can choose. And this perception does not arise from elaborate words. It arises from the tone, from the break, from the absence of pressure. There is a subtle moment when resistance begins to give way, not because it was broken, but because it is no longer necessary. In the next moments of this journey, let's get closer to this delicate point, where the request turns into an invitation, and help stops being taken away to be offered as a natural gesture. Because just like in the forest, the most effective way is not always the most direct. When we look closely at how collaboration emerges naturally, we see that it is not born from conviction but from the absence of friction. Whenever two people come into contact, there is an invisible adjustment taking place, a kind of mutual reading, almost instinctive, in which each person tries to understand whether that encounter represents safety or threat. Resistance appears when this adjustment fails. Most of the time, it is not the content of the request that generates opposition, but the feeling that something is being demanded. Even polite requests can carry tension. One simple, "Can you help me?" may sound internally like, "I hope you help," or even, "You should help." The body realizes this before the rational mind, and when perceives, creates barriers. The principle of non-resistance begins exactly at this point. He doesn't propose that you give up what you need, even if it cancels itself out. He suggests something more subtle. Withdraw from the order any trace of imposition, even if unconscious. It is an internal change before be verbal. In nature, paths are not opened by direct force but by gentle repetition. Trails, they arise because someone passed by there many times without violating the land. Little by little, the earth gives way, not out of pressure but out of familiarity. With people, the process is similar. When someone feels that their freedom remains intact, the tendency, it's natural to get closer, not move away. The most common mistake is to believe that by relieving pressure, the result will be indifference. In practice, the opposite occurs. The absence of pressure generates curiosity. Curiosity generates opening, and openness creates space for collaboration. This principle requires a change in posture that is not always comfortable. He asks that you are willing to accept a no without reacting, because only when no is really possible, the yes gains value. If the other person senses that you will be frustrated, resentful, or insistent in the face of a refusal, she is no longer free. And at the moment as freedom disappears, resistance returns. Non-resistance also means letting go of the need to control the outcome. We often ask for help already imagining how it should be offered, at what time, with what attitude. This creates a rigid frame that the other person feels immediately. When removing this expectation, you give the other person back the autonomy over how, when, and if they want to contribute. In everyday life, this attitude manifests itself in practical ways. Instead of submitting an application closed, you present an open possibility. Instead of overly justifying why that you need help, you trust that the other person will understand enough. Instead of fill silences with arguments, you allow pauses. Silence in this context is not empty. It functions as a decision space. When one does not feel rushed to respond, the mind relaxes. And when the mind relaxes, the collaboration stops being a burden and becomes a legitimate option. There is also an important internal aspect. Non-resistance requires you to be in peace with the idea of resolving the situation alone if necessary, not as giving up, but as emotional stability. When the other person realizes that you don't depend desperate for his response, the relationship becomes balanced. The request is no longer a test, and it becomes an invitation. This is a delicate point, because it touches the ego. Oftentimes, We want help not just for the practical result, but for the validation it brings. We want to feel that the other matters. When this expectation is removed, something profoundly changes in the dynamic. In the next few moments, we will get closer to how this internal posture transforms in concrete words, not as a formula, but as a natural reflection of those who have already. It does not fight against resistance, and for that very reason, it begins to go through it. There is a specific moment in any human interaction when collaboration can be born or die. This moment does not happen when the sentence is said, but when it is received internally by the other. It is there that the posture behind the words reveals itself. No, it doesn't matter how polite or well-formulated the sentence is if, behind it, there is haste, expectation, or demand. The other notices. You always understand. Therefore, the so-called phrase that creates collaboration should not be understood as a construction. They are not intelligently verbal, but as a gesture. It works like a silent signal that says, I'm not trying to move you. I'm not trying to push you into a position that is not yours. You remain free. In practice, this phrase usually has one characteristic in common. It returns control to the another. Instead of leading the response, it opens space for the decision to happen without pressure. There is no disguised urgency. There is no emotional insistence. There is clarity without rigidity. When someone hears something like this, the defense system relaxes. The mind stops searching threats and begins to evaluate possibilities. It's a subtle but powerful transition. The help, it stops being a reaction and becomes a choice. This sentence doesn't need to be long. Often, the simpler, the better. What matters is not the literal content but the implicit message. If it's not possible, it's all well. This permission completely changes the field of conversation. She breaks the cycle resistance automatic that so many people carry. A common mistake is trying to use this posture as a strategy, expecting a result specific. When this happens, the gesture loses authenticity. The other feels that the freedom offered is only apparent. Therefore, this phrase only works when it is true, when you are truly willing to accept any answer without resentment. This point is essential. The collaboration generated by this type of phrase does not come from fear of disappointment, nor of moral obligation. It comes from relief. The other feels they can help without committing beyond what you want. And interestingly, it is in this state that they usually offer more than expected. In the work environment, this manifests itself when someone asks for support, making it clear that understands the other's priorities, not as a formality but as real recognition. In the family, it appears when the request is not loaded with past history, guilt, or comparisons. In relationships, it arises when support is not required as proof of love. This phrase also works because it doesn't invade other people's time. She doesn't require immediate response. By allowing the person to think, you create a healthy break. This interval is where the decision matures. Pressing for response closes this space and forces a defensive reaction. There is also an important internal aspect. Whoever uses this posture is not trying to protect from rejection. You are comfortable with your position. This creates a balance invisible. The relationship is no longer asymmetrical, where one needs more than the other. When this asymmetry disappears, help stops being a favor and becomes a contribution spontaneous. It is important to understand that this phrase does not guarantee collaboration in all cases. Some people won't help, regardless of posture. But even in these cases, something changes. Refusal does not generate conflict, does not create accumulated tension, leaves no residue emotional. The relationship remains intact. This is especially relevant in repeated situations. When someone notices you respect her limits consistently. Trust builds over time, and trust is fertile ground for future collaboration. Much help comes not in the first order, but on the second or third, when the standard has already been established. Deep down, this phrase is just the external manifestation of a more internal change. Deep. It reflects someone who does not fight resistance, who does not try to overcome the other, that does not turn every interaction into a field of dispute. Someone who understands that collaboration is not extracted, it is allowed. In the next step of this journey, we will look at what happens when, even with this stance, the other person still doesn't want to help. and how the smoothness, maintained throughout the time, continues to act where strength has always failed. Even when the posture is correct, even when the request is made without pressure, there are situations where the other person simply doesn't want to help. This is part of reality human. Not all resistance dissolves on first contact, and it is precisely at this point that many people abandon softness and return to the old pattern of insistence or of definitive removal. Non-resistance does not mean that the positive response is immediate. It means that the process continues to operate even when the result does not appear. When someone says no, but realize that this is not genuinely respected, something important happens internally. The person stops feeling confrontational. The defense system does not need but stay active. The most common mistake at this point is to interpret refusal as definitive closure. In most of the time, she isn't. It is just a temporary limit, linked to tiredness, priorities, insecurity, or past experiences. When you respond to no with visible frustration or emotional distance, reinforces the idea that there was a hidden expectation. This reactivates the resistance. Maintaining softness after refusal requires internal maturity. It means to continue treating the another in the same way without changing tone, without irony, without indirect charge. This behavior breaks a pattern deeply rooted in human relationships, the exchange implicit. Many people are used to helping just to avoid consequences negative. When they realize that there is no emotional punishment for refusing, something happens, reorganizes. Over time, this absence of tension creates a curious effect. The person begins to reconsider on your own, not because she was pressured, but because the request stopped being fulfilled. Represent risk. Help, which previously seemed like a burden, is now seen as a neutral possibility. In some cases, it appears spontaneously, in a moment unexpected, without you having to ask again. It is important to understand that softness works in layers. She doesn't look for results immediate, but relational stability. When the relationship stabilizes, collaboration makes it more likely. This is visible in environments where people live with frequency. Those who never press tend to receive more support over time than those who insists. There is also the possibility that help will never come, and this needs to be accepted without dramatization. Non-resistance includes the ability to move forward without resentment. When you can do this, you preserve something essential: your emotional autonomy. You don't get caught up in the other person's response. This, in itself, already changes the dynamic. Interestingly, people who demonstrate this autonomy tend to awaken more respect, not because they are cold, but because they don't put others in a position uncomfortable. They don't turn every request into a test of loyalty or empathy. This posture creates lighter and less defensive relationships. Another important point is to avoid automatic repetition of the order. Repeat, even with good words, can reactivate the feeling of pressure. Instead, the smoothness manifests in waiting. Not an anxious wait, but a real pause. The pause communicates confidence. She says, "I'm not trying to push you into a decision." During this interval, behavior speaks more than any sentence. The way you act after the refusal is noted, even if silently. If you remain coherent, accessible, and stable, the image that others have of you changes. You let from being someone who wants something and becoming someone predictable in the best sense of the word. This predictability creates security. And security is one of the biggest motivators of human collaboration. People help when they know there will be no consequences, hidden charges, future charges, or sudden changes in attitude. Therefore, when the other does not want to help, softness is not abandoned. She is in depth. It is at this stage that it differentiates itself from technique and reveals itself as a posture real, a stance that does not depend on the behavior of others to sustain itself. In the next step, we will bring this understanding inward, because in the end, the external collaboration is just a reflection of the internal state of the person asking, and it is there, in interior, that the real adjustment happens. After understanding how softness works in relationships, an inevitable point arises. None of this can be sustained if it is not rooted in the internal state of the person asking. An external collaboration is always a direct reflection of the internal organization. When there is anxiety, lack, or emotional urgency, this permeates any sentence, even the most careful. Therefore, true change does not begin in language, but in internal disposition. Before speaking, there is a silent alignment. This is where you recognize if you are asking out of genuine need or dependence. This difference is subtle but decisive. The need accepts the possibility of not being met. Dependence, no. Reintegrating this teaching means learning to remain whole even without an answer. When you don't fragment yourself in the face of refusal, the request stops being a risk. The other you feel like you don't carry the weight of your emotional stability. This creates a lighter field, where collaboration can emerge without guilt or obligation. This internal state is built with practice. He requires a pause before ordering. Demands observe your own body, the rhythm of your breathing, your mental tone. Often the best preparing to ask for help is internally accepting that you can go on without it. No as resignation, but as autonomy. When this autonomy is present, the request becomes clear, simple, and honest. There is also an aspect of purification of intention. Ask yourself, am I trying to avoid discomfort? Am I seeking validation? I want the other person to solve something that I myself don't want to face? These questions do not require a verbal answer, just conscience. When you recognize them, the energy of the request changes. In everyday life, this manifests as calm. The request does not come with explanations. Excessive. It is not accompanied by long justifications or attempts to anticipate objections. He appears at the appropriate time, with sufficient words, iants, and space for silence. This silence is not empty. It's an interval where the other can feel whether they want to or not move. When this reintegration happens, something curious emerges. You begin to realize that many situations are resolved without any request. People volunteer, paths if open. This does not happen because of merit or reward, but because the tension has decreased. Where there is less tension, the movement flows. It also becomes easier to accept limits. Do you realize that not all collaboration is necessary? Not all help is appropriate. Some refusals protect both sides. When this is understood, frustration loses its strength. The request is no longer a test of personal value and becomes just a practical element of life. This internal state also transforms how you receive help. There is no charge implicit, nor a feeling of debt. Help is welcomed as a free gesture, not as an obligation fulfilled. This preserves the relationship and avoids unbalanced exchange cycles. Spiritual reintegration in this context is not something abstract. It happens when you stop fighting against immediate reality, when you accept people's rhythm, when trust that forcing is rarely the most effective path. This trust is not passivity, it is discernment. Over time, this posture becomes natural. You no longer need to remember principles or adjust words consciously. The way of asking changes because the way of being changes. And when that happens, collaboration is no longer something to be provoked. It appears as consequence. In the next and final moment of this journey, we will close this path with a synthesis clear, not as a definitive conclusion but as an opening, because in the end, the real collaboration is not an external agreement. It is a silent reflection of those who no longer offer resistance to the flow of relationships. At the end of this journey, it is clear that collaboration was never something to be achieved. It does not respond to pressure, nor to insistence, nor to disguised need. She appears when space is preserved, when the relationship stops being a field of forces and becomes a ground of trust. The so-called phrase that creates collaboration is not a verbal trick. She is just the external aspect of an organized internal state. When you don't invade, don't demand, and don't supports the other emotionally, something changes. Help stops being a defensive reaction and becomes a conscious choice. This does not mean that everyone will collaborate, nor does it mean that the result will always be what you want. The true effect of this path is deeper. It preserves relationships, reduces silent conflicts, prevents accumulated wear and tear, and above all, it maintains whole you, regardless of the response you receive. When smoothness becomes constant, interactions transform. People feel that can approach without risk. They feel they don't need to protect themselves. And in this state, collaboration arises more frequently, often without being asked. Not for obligation, but naturally. There is a specific tranquility in knowing how to ask without getting lost. in accepting no without harden, to continue being present without charging. This tranquility is noticeable. She creates a type of silent authority, which is not imposed, but sustained. And this authority is intuitively respected. Over time, you realize that you no longer need to adjust phrases or strategies. Oh, the way of asking changes because the way of relating has changed. The order becomes simple, direct, open, and above all, honest. There is no subtext. There is no hidden expectation, just a royal invitation. If this path made sense to you, consider remaining aware of the small everyday interactions. Notice where there is still rush, where there is still tension, where there is still an attempt to control the other's response. These points do not need to be fought, just recognized. The smoothness starts there. If this reflection brought clarity, it is worth continuing to walk towards this type of understanding. Sign up and follow us on this silent journey where less force generates more movement, and less control creates more connection. And perhaps, at some point, you will notice something curious. What you called resistance was never in the other. It was just an invitation to adjust the way you place yourself in the invisible flow of relationships.